Austin does not sleep so much as it hums. The river breathes its wide, slow breath, and the towers along the water blink like a patient animal. On the night the brag landed in my kitchen, the sky was the clean blue of a screensaver, and the air smelled like cut limes and summer dust. I had set the table for a quiet dinner because Serena said a client meeting ran long and she would come home hungry. I placed a cloth napkin the color of iron by her plate and one the color of wheat by mine. I poured water and watched the way it held light, like a promise it might keep if no one lied to it. The iPad on the counter coughed out a bubble of sound. We kept the device for recipes and lists and holiday photos that arrived from relatives we never see. It had lived in our kitchen so long that it had learned the shape of steam. I wiped my hands on a towel and reached for it. A message had slid across the screen and stayed because the person who wrote it wanted to be seen. The thread had a name I did not recognize. The line that stared at me was a little horn. "Don't worry, I will drain him dry." That is a sentence you do not unhear. It built a small theater at the base of my skull and demanded seats for its friends. I did not tap anything at first. I turned the iPad over and looked at the case as if windows might appear and show me a better world. Then I turned it back and found the settings and took a picture of the screen with my phone. I did not forward the image. I did not reply as someone else to lure a confession. I am a risk manager. I do not hunt. I document. I checked the iCloud account name with the same quiet I use when I search a ledger for a lie. The address belonged to Serena. She had set it up years ago when we believed nothing in our house would ever need a lawyer. The device listed a log of sync times. It showed that messages had been mirroring here for months. I opened the thread and let my eyes become a camera. I scrolled without interacting and let my mind hold shapes instead of heat. There was talk about plans. There was talk about money. There was talk about ease and how some men make themselves into open taps. There was a name that arrived again and again. Dane. It sat in the text with the confidence of a chair that knows no one will move it. I breathed and looked at the stove where rice was pretending to become a better version of itself. I turned off the flame and put a lid on the pot and slid it to the back burner. I placed the iPad on the shelf next to the cookbooks. Then I went into the living room and celebrated the ordinary, because ordinary was the ship on which I would sail out of this storm. I lined up the shoes by the door. I took a cup to the sink. I wiped a smudge off a framed print of a street we walked on during a season when Serena liked to take pictures of my profile as if it were a kind of landmark. I did not speak when Serena came in. She smiled that quick camera smile that people in public relations keep sharpened like knives. She kissed the air near my cheek and rattled a story about clients and a campaign and an award that would almost certainly be given to someone less capable than she is. She washed her hands and reached for the iPad to flip through recipes, the way a person flips through channels when they do not know what they want. She saw the screen, and then she saw me seeing the screen. Her face did the smallest possible change a human face can do while staying a human face. She put the iPad back on the shelf. She asked about my day. I told her a vendor had tried to pass a fake invoice through our system, and I had caught it before any money learned to run. She laughed and called me a magician. I served rice and fish, and we ate. I did not ask about Dane. She did not offer him. That night, I moved our communication to a medium that remembers. I sent a text to Serena, even though she was in the next room. For the coming days, let's keep everything in writing. Scheduling, money, plans. She wrote back with a line that tried to turn policy into romance. I resisted. I said I was tired and would sleep in the other room, and we could discuss calendars tomorrow. She sent a heart. I looked at the small red shape and thought about arteries. Morning rose like a slow hand opening. I jogged the trail by the water and let thoughts parcel themselves into pieces I could carry. I made coffee and set bills in stacks and paid the ones that should be paid. I stared at our joint account and traced the patterns of this life like a river map. I saw transfers I had not clocked as odd until now. Small at first, then larger. The names on the receiving end had the bland charm of limited liability. The dates matched weekends Serena claimed she was leading workshops or cultivating clients. I exported statements and highlighted entries as if I were teaching a class on how to hear what numbers say when you stop interrupting. At work, I sat in a room where walls are glass because that is how companies signal that nothing is hidden. I watched flows of money behave and rebel. I approved holds when documents were partial and declined holds when a file finally told the truth. I called an analyst and asked her to keep an eye out for a new merchant account owned by a wellness studio with an eagerness that might outrun its compliance. I did not tell her the studio was a man with a taste for other people fountains. I did not use my access to peek into fields that belong to the part of me that is a husband. I have rules because rules have saved more lives than any seduction. I met with a lawyer that afternoon in a room with a view of cranes. Her name was Asha, and she makes words into scaffolds. She asked me to tell the story like I would tell a risk committee about a cluster of suspicious activity. I explained the iPad and the messages and the bank patterns and the invoices that smelled like perfume instead of labor. I did not inject adjectives where evidence could stand on its own legs. She listened, and then she unfolded a plan that felt like walking along a highway while a storm rides the other side of the rail. Temporary restraining orders to freeze transfers larger than a certain breath. An affidavit of dissipation to tell the court that money had begun to wander. Discovery demands for logs and emails and receipts. A petition for a constructive trust over funds that fled to Dane. She asked me to stay as clean as a man can be while he is elbow deep in a heart that has stopped being careful. I sent a preservation letter to the bank and another to the email provider that holds Serena's archived statements. We collected what the law calls voluntarily shared access because last April, in a burst of domestic goodwill, Serena had given me the login to a tax folder so I could collect receipts while she rehearsed a speech. I pulled down invoice PDFs and looked for the fingerprints data leave even when they are trying to be coy. Dates that do not agree with time zones. Templates stolen from a vendor and reskinned with new words like transformation and elite plan. Amounts rounded in a way that says, not this month, but this story. I put the files in a vault and wrote captions like a museum of a marriage that had been busy painting over cracks. I called the credit union where we keep what we used to call a future. I asked to put two-step checks on transfers and to require both signatures for any movement over numbers that would make a week's worth of groceries look small. I set alerts that ping my phone the way birds ping the air when a hawk rolls over them. I moved the small emergency fund with my name on it to a place Serena cannot see on her banking screen. I ate a sandwich and did not taste it. I drank water because the body becomes a sullen horse if you do not water it. The first twist came easy. A card charge on a corporate statement from Serena's office, posted at 10 in the evening on a night she had claimed to be in a late session with a client who lives exclusively in daylight. The charge description sang wellness in a font you can hear and named a package with a title that sounded like a promise to be rich without having to do arithmetic. I did not work at her company. I did not have the right to cross that wall. But people who believe rules are for others often teach on their own time. Serena sent me a photo once of a receipt, and the barcode in that image belongs to a system that keeps logs. I wrote a letter to their compliance department and explained the conflict of interest risk using language that comes preloaded inside anyone who likes policy more than parties. I did not mention the affair. I did not need to. The universe would work that out for me in its own time. Dane opened a merchant account with a processor that often feeds into ours. I knew it not because I searched for him by name, but because a colleague sent over a file to review and said the profile felt wrong in his hands. The KYC was thin, and the address listed a suite that no one with rent would brag about. I suggested enhanced verification and a rolling reserve. The file went to a higher shelf and sat there. Money that might have rushed now had to walk with a hall monitor. I slept that night with the window cracked and listened to the city whisper, "Go slowly." I made dinner 2 nights after the brag. Serena arrived with a smile set to maximum and a story about a coworker who had broken a rule and been caught. She asked me who on earth would be foolish enough to betray a company with eyes. I said people who believe they are charming enough to pass counterfeit kindness as currency. She laughed and kissed the air again. After dessert, I asked her in a text to send me a list of every autopay we had active and to confirm which ones she wanted to keep. She wrote back a list that looked like a map of a town where every street leads to a spa. I canceled the ones that were pretense and kept the ones that kept the lights on. On Saturday, I walked to the studio where Dane held classes for people who like to believe breath can fix any economic model. I stood across the street by a tree that knew more about patience than anyone in that building. I watched him welcome a woman in a hat that cost a decision. I watched him text while a class moved their arms in a slow collective wave. I watched him laugh with a man who delivered boxes that probably contained a flavor of protein powder named after a word that used to mean courage. I did not go in. I let the place outline itself on the back of my eyelids, and then I left with the knowledge that I could find it again even in a storm. The second twist came in the form of a spreadsheet. Serena had faked an invoice by copying a vendor's exact numbering system from last year and swapping the name. She sent it to herself at home with a note about filing and made a folder with the boldness of a thief who thinks museums are made for them. The metadata put its hands in the air. The creation date lived in a different time than the sent date. The program information confessed it had been born from a template from a site that sells hope to freelancers. The document properties included a username that did not belong to her. I printed it and underlined 3 parts with a pencil, because I am a man who honors pencils. Asha filed the motions. The court set a hearing faster than I expected because sometimes even a crowded docket hears urgency when a story shows up with documentation dressed like a soldier. I went to the bank with a stack of papers that smelled like toner and exactness. We froze transfers. We set thresholds and triggers. We instructed someone called a fraud liaison to call me every time a number tried to be bolder than it should. I felt like a man bracing his feet before a gust. Serena's promotion party arrived on a Thursday that wore the same sun as Tuesday had. I did not plan to attend. An associate from her office sent me a message that the venue was beautiful and that Serena was glowing and that she loved to watch people who win. I wore a shirt that fits like the truth and walked there because seeing the room would help me picture it when I needed to remember what happened. The host stand had a list with lines that make people feel recorded. I saw Serena's name and a block called Celebration. I saw the event preceding hers was a compliance seminar with a title that promised the world would be better if we all read more carefully. I smiled without showing my teeth. I stood by the door and became a column. I watched Serena glide between tables and place hands on shoulders, as if she were a priest with a stack of temporary blessings. The phone in her hand buzzed twice. I could see the lock screen from the angle of a man who knows how to tilt his head like a doorman. The bank logo bloomed twice with messages about holds. She touched the screen and exhaled a short laugh, like a balloon losing a little air. Then a server came with champagne, and the world pretended to be impressed with itself. I took that as my cue to step outside because Asha had arranged a better scene somewhere else. The process server met me on the sidewalk and showed me the documents with a finger on each corner so the wind would not claim them. He is a professional in the art of timing. He walked in and asked for Serena at the seam of 2 conversations. He placed the envelope in her hand. and said the line that ends pretending. She stood very still, and the people with drinks made faces like flowers caught in a sudden shade. I did not hang around to watch the part where she looked for me. I was not there. I was walking away under a line of trees that had not asked to witness this and would forget it by morning. Dane learned about the freeze when his payments did not arrive on time. The platform had placed his funds in a cooling box with a polite note about verification and discrepancies. He texted Serena, and the text landed on the kitchen iPad because Serena had never turned off the setting that asks the world to keep her company. He wrote about lawyers, and this is theft, and I will go to the papers. She wrote about handling it. She wrote about men who panic. She wrote about my preferences and called them moral theater. I screenshotted only what I needed to prove knowledge and to prove intent. I did not need every insult. I needed the admission that she had known about the invoices and the transfers and had considered them part of a plan. The third twist arrived courtesy of HR. The compliance lead at her company is a woman who believes in hard floors and good chairs. She called to thank me for bringing a potential conflict to her attention in the language of people who no litigation might be reading. She said the internal review showed charges inconsistent with policy. She said they had interviewed Serena and that she had given answers that made wolves stretch. She said they would be placing her on leave pending the outcome. I said I hoped for fairness for everyone, and meant it, though fairness has sharp edges when it cuts away a lie. Asha and I met in a conference room with a wall of glass that turned downtown into a map of lines. She showed me the draft motion for a constructive trust over funds moving to Dane. She explained that the court could require the return of those sums and hold them until a final order divided what could be divided. She showed me the draft restraining order on asset transfers. She showed me the affidavit I would sign that detailed the story without calling anyone names. She handed me a pen, and I wrote my name the way I did on our marriage certificate when the priest asked if I promised to be good at guessing the weather. The hearing felt like the white side of a storm cloud. There was light and enough wind to keep dust from getting ideas. Asha spoke and laid out the timeline. She named dates and amounts and described the way invoices can be real in shape and fake in heart. She placed the messages in sequence like a path that leads to the kind of hill you do not want to roll down. The other lawyer attempted to turn water into smoke and ended up wet. Serena sat straight with the poise of a woman who has ridden through worse publicity storms in her mind. The judge asked exactly the kind of questions that remind you why buildings like this exist. Who had access to which accounts? When were the notifications changed? How do you know these invoices are copies? Asha answered with receipts and logs and the still power of the phrase as per the attachment. The judge granted a temporary constructive trust and a restraining order on further transfers. The judge allowed expedited discovery. The judge scheduled a mediation and reminded everyone that paper is kinder than fire. I walked out, and the sunlight landed on my face like a hand that wanted nothing. I bought a bottle of water from a cart and stood watching people who had no idea they were breathing in a world that had just been tilted by a few degrees. My phone buzzed with an alert from the bank because a scheduled transfer had been denied pursuant to a hold. I took a slow breath and thought about the phrase pursuant to as if it were a kind of art. Dane tried charm before he chose anger. He sent messages that used words like misunderstanding and business and good faith. When the charm did not open the safe, he wrote again with different fuel. He said he would drag this through mud until no one looked clean. He said he had friends who write for sites that pretend to care about fairness. He said there were always other platforms that love cash. I forwarded his notes to Asha and to the fraud liaison, and filed them next to the clinical records of the week. My chest became a locked room with its own weather. In the quiet between deadlines, I replayed the weeks that led me here. The smell of lemon oil on the table, the way Serena had started to laugh with her head tipped back like an actor delivering a line. The look on her face when she checked her phone and saw the bank logo like a crest announcing a new kingdom. I thought about my own part in this. The moments I chose quiet instead of naming a worry. The ways I made certainty out of hope because hope is easy and certainty requires measuring. I did not turn these thoughts into a stick to beat myself with. I turned them into nails for the scaffolding of whoever I would be next. Mediation day came dressed like a weekday that had nothing better to do. We sat across from each other at a table that had listened to hundreds of couples discover whether they were someone else when they were honest. The mediator asked for numbers and proposals, and I let Asha do the first dance. She listed the accounts and the transfers under trust and the split of property that no longer felt like mine, because property stops feeling like yours when someone calls it a pot to draw from. Serena stared at the tabletop as if a map might appear. Dane attended by phone because courage is a local commodity for some men. He attempted to talk. The mediator muted him with the kind of skill a teacher develops in a school where doors do not latch. We settled on a path that gave me the house and the retirement accounts, and asked Serena to take her own debts to the other side of the river. Dane agreed to return funds that had arrived under the cover of invoices that did not deserve to wear numbers. Asha wrote the terms with the elegance of a blade. The mediator nodded as if we had all behaved. I did not feel victorious. I felt like a man who had dragged a heavy thing across a threshold and set it down without dropping it on his foot. The months after looked normal from space. I woke early and ran and went to work and kept ships from capsizing. I returned home and cooked food that tasted like effort and sometimes grace. I cleaned the sink after dinner because I read once that the kitchen is a heart and hearts like to be emptied of the day before the next one starts. I heard updates from HR about Serena's career that I will not write down because even wolves deserve privacy when they sleep. I saw Dane one afternoon on a street where money pretends to be sunshine. He was carrying a box. He did not see me. I let the moment go like a balloon I did not choose to inflate. At night, I sat with a notebook and I wrote lines that did not try to be beautiful. The first line was always the date. The second was the weather. The third was the sentence that told me who I had been that day. I wrote I was steady. I wrote I asked for help. I wrote I kept receipts. No one clapped, and I felt better for it. People ask me sometimes how I did not explode. They say if someone wrote those words about them, they would have burned down the street. I tell them the truth. I have seen what fire does to people who live near it. I work with systems that exist because someone once tried to light a match in a vault. I have learned to make water feel like victory. I poured water on every part of this that tried to spark. I kept my hands clean and my voice low. I wrote, I waited, I filed, I called, I signed, I walked, I slept, I woke. The world did not end. It rebalanced like a house after a train passes. I kept the iPad in a drawer for a while after the case closed because I did not trust myself not to stare at it like an oracle. One morning, I took it out and wiped it and reset it to factory and loaded a recipe for bread. I set it back on the counter where it belonged and taught myself how to make a loaf that makes mornings kinder. My hands learned the rhythm of folding and waiting and turning and waiting and adding heat at the right time. Dough does not lie. It rises or it does not. It forgives if you give it time, and it punishes if you rush it. It is a better teacher than any book on love I have ever read. Serena moved to a smaller place north of the river, where the wind has more room to play. I heard that through a friend who sees everything and says little. Dane vanished into the same set of streets he had emerged from, because the city is generous to men who can smile and sell breath. I do not check his accounts. I do not wonder about his clients. I keep my eyes on the ledger that belongs to my life and my work. The rest is noise that would love to be music. On an evening that felt like a throat clearing before rain, I stood on the bridge and watched planes carve quiet into the high air. I remembered the first night Serena introduced me to her team and told them I catch thieves in numbers so the world keeps turning. I remembered how proud I was of the way she could fill a room with confidence. I remembered the way confidence looks when you peel it and discover it is thin. I let the memories be a set of cards I do not need to play anymore. I dropped them in the river, one at a time, without ritual, because not everything requires ceremony to become past. I am not a saint. I am a man who did not want his life turned into a cautionary tale written by someone worse at grammar than I am. I wanted accuracy and a quiet kitchen and a bed that believes it will be slept in by one person at a time. I got those things. They did not arrive wrapped in applause. They arrived like the sun arrives every morning that your eyes decide to open. When friends hear pieces of this, they ask for advice. I never tell them to spy. I never tell them to trap. I tell them to write. I tell them to screen capture only what they must, and to respect the laws that keep people safe even when they do not feel like friends. I tell them to find a lawyer who sounds like a bridge. I tell them to freeze what should not move and to let go of what was never theirs. I tell them to avoid speeches in expensive rooms and to store their energy for hinges and filters and long walks. They nod and say it sounds hard. It is. Hard is how you build anything worth standing under. The rest of this is not a twist. It is a series of gestures that make a home. I keep a spare set of keys in a box I can find in the dark. I keep cash in a hidden envelope so a small emergency does not become a large crisis. I keep copies of the documents that matter in a folder that would survive water. I keep the address of the clerk who stamps the papers that tell you where you stand in a stack of other people's problems. I keep the phone number of the analyst who sees patterns before the machine does. I keep my shoes by the door facing the right way, so when I need to leave, I do not have to turn around first. I keep my name clean on paper because it takes longer to wash than any favorite shirt. Out on the trail on a morning with fog thick enough to make towers humble, I passed a man walking a dog who looked like it had been assembled from spare parts of gods. The man nodded, and I nodded, and we kept moving. I thought about the sentence that started this. Don't worry, I will drain him dry. The promise in it had been a boast and a laziness. It assumed only one of us could hold a valve. It assumed the world would cooperate with a plan because the plan was loud. I did not meet loud with louder. I met it with a notebook and a hand steady enough to draw a line in the air, and then on paper, and then in a court file, and then in a ledger, and then in the morning light of my own kitchen. There are nights when I sit at the table, and the house makes those tiny settling sounds. Houses make when they remember they used to be trees and stones. I look at the loaf on the cooling rack, and the dish towel, and the knife that will cut without tearing. I breathe and thank the part of me that did not answer insult with drama. I thank the system that worked because people told the truth into it. I thank the luck that kept me from wanting a stage more than I wanted a life. I wanted to be emptied of lies. I was. She did not expect me to do that. She thought drain meant money. I learned it could mean something cleaner. I drained our life of the parts that turned love into a budget line for someone else's upgrade. I drained our accounts of fraud. I drained my own mouth of speeches I would regret. I drained the day of anything that could set the night on fire. What remains is water in a glass on a table that holds. I drink it and feel human again. Time did the last work. It always does. The alarm goes off. The coffee tastes like a story that learned not to brag. The city hums. The river breathes. The towers blink. I stand in my kitchen with a loaf cooling and a notebook open and a phone that no longer hums with other people's schemes. I wash a plate. I dry it. I put it away. I go to work to keep rivers of money from turning into floods of harm. I come home and make dinner. I eat it alone without feeling alone. I sleep. I wake. I keep my hands steady. I keep receipts. I stay the kind of man who can hear a brag and not let it derail the bridge he is building one beam at a time. Austin kept humming through late summer, and the river carried heat away in slow, patient breaths. I set new hours for myself, and the house learned them like a song you hear enough to trust. Bread cooled on the rack without trying to be a metaphor. The ledger of our life settled into rows that made sense. The kitchen stopped waiting for arguments and started waiting for water at a boil. There were no miracles. There were tasks finished on time and doors that closed clean and a bed that forgot how to hold strangers. That was enough. Asha sent a short note after the final orders. Live the plan and let the plan speak. I taped the sentence in my mind and let it guide corners. Funds returned under the trust landed where they should, and then stopped wanting to move. The bank alerts grew quiet. Compliance closed its file with a line that did not need applause. The court calendar no longer owned my weeks. Steady replaced urgent, and the air in the house changed temperature. I did not look for the faces that had cheered the old storm. I looked for smaller things that prove a home remembers who it belongs to. A clean sink before sleep. Shoes turned the right way by the door. Keys on a hook that never goes on walkabout. A radio low on a Sunday while dough waits to rise. The rhythm was honest. It asked for effort at the right times and rest at the others. Workdays stopped feeling like trials. Evenings learned to arrive without debt. On a morning with fog low over the water, I ran the trail and thought about the first message that tried to make me a reservoir for someone else's plan. Drain him dry. The words had traveled so far for so little. They had been a boast that mistook volume for power. They had no place here now. I was not a reservoir. I was a man with a roof to keep sound, and a ledger to keep square, and a kitchen that held heat like a friend. Serena moved north, and the city folded her into a grid that does not remember names for long. Dane chased another season in another room that sells breath as a product. I left them to their errands. My errands were humbler and more durable. Pay the bill. Keep the pantry honest. Replace the filter before the water complains. Return the library book. Sharpen the knife. Call my mother. Set out the flour before dinner so it sheds its chill. Friends asked if anger ever knocked after the papers were signed. It did, sometimes late and without warning. I met it with motion that did not seek an audience. I ran the block and back. I wiped the counter until light slid across it without catching. I wrote a line in the notebook that only needed a date and a sentence. Held steady today. The act of writing made the room feel less crowded. Anger learned to use the door like a guest with manners. When heat finally broke, the first cold front made sidewalks smell like stone washed clean. I stood on the bridge at dusk and watched planes cut pale trails in a sky that was almost violet. This city has its own grammar. Towers speak in pulses. Water edits mistakes without comment. Trains underline the hour. I had become fluent again. The lesson cost more than I had planned, and still felt like a bargain compared to the price of noise work kept trusting me with systems that only behave when someone patient holds the reins. I like that. Numbers do not lie unless a human asks them to. Logs confess if you ask the right way. A rule either holds or it breaks. That certainty washed over the rest of my life and left it cleaner. I cooked simple food and ate without negotiation. I slept because sleep makes daylight a better place to live. I woke and the mirror did not laugh. On a quiet Sunday, I mixed flour and water and salt and waited. The dough grew in the bowl with a slow pride that did not beg for witnesses. While it rested, I wrote 3 postcards to friends I had neglected during the storm and thanked them for staying when I had no news, except the news that process takes time. The oven took the loaf and gave it back dark and whole. I cut it open and steam carried the room into a softer hour. The last thing I kept from that season was a habit of proof, not to spy. To document what matters so confusion cannot invent stories for me in the dark. Receipts filed where they belong. Alerts tuned to whisper only when a number crosses a line. A calendar that holds truth better than memory. It is not paranoia. It is respect for the limits of a tired mind. It leaves more room for kindness because it carries less fear. When winter came, the river slowed and the towers blinked like a patient animal again. I thought of the first night when I chose paper over fire and felt grateful to that version of me. He gave me a life I could live. The city did not change for me. It never will. I changed for the city that holds me. I set the table for one, and it looked complete. I called a friend for dinner, and the table looked complete in a different way. I slept and did not bargain with the ceiling. Morning arrived, and there was work that needed doing. I did it, and then I came home and did the work that turns a room into shelter. This is what happened after the boast tried to make me a story that ends in smoke. I chose breath that does not lie. I keep going, days stacked like clean plates, and the cupboard did not rattle. The phone stopped acting like a siren and returned to being a tool. I learned the names of neighbors I had only waved at, and the block felt smaller in the good way. On clear nights, I stood on the balcony and listened to the low engine of the city and thought about the distance between loud victory and quiet repair. Quiet repair wins. It lasts. It does not demand a crowd. It simply refuses to fail and then refuses again. By spring, I could tell time by the sound of bikes on the trail and the first call from the bakery at dawn. I had built a life that did not need to shout to be true. And it was mine to keep days stacked like clean plates, and the cupboard did not rattle. The phone stopped acting like a siren and returned to being a tool. I learned the names of neighbors I'd only waved at, and the block felt smaller in the good way. On clear nights, I stood on the balcony and listened to the low engine of the city and thought about the distance between loud victory and quiet repair. Quiet repair wins. It lasts. It does not demand a crowd. It simply refuses to fail, and then refuses again. By spring, I could tell time by the sound of bikes on the trail, and the first call from the bakery at dawn. I had built a life that did not need to shout to be true, and it was mine to keep days stacked like clean plates, and the cupboard did not rattle. The phone stopped acting like a siren and returned to being a tool. I learned the names of neighbors I had only waved at, and the block felt smaller in the good way. On clear nights, I stood on the balcony and listened to the low engine of the city and thought about the distance between loud victory and quiet repair. Quiet repair wins. It lasts. It does not demand a crowd. It simply refuses to fail and then refuses again. By spring, I could tell time by the sound of bikes on the trail and the first call from the bakery at dawn. I had built a life that did not need to shout to be true, and it was mine to keep days stacked like clean plates, and the cupboard did not rattle. The phone stopped acting like a siren and returned to being a tool. I learned the names of neighbors I'd only waved at, and the block felt smaller in the good way. On clear nights, I stood on the balcony and listened to the low engine of the city and thought about the distance between loud victory and quiet repair. Quiet repair wins. It lasts. It does not demand a crowd. It simply refuses to fail and then refuses again. By spring, I could tell time by the sound of bikes on the trail and the first call from the bakery at dawn. I had built a life that did not need to shout to be true, and it was mine to keep days stacked like clean plates, and the cupboard did not rattle. The phone stopped acting like a siren and returned to being a tool. I learned the names of neighbors I had only waved at, and the block felt smaller in the good way. On clear nights, I stood on the balcony and listened to the low engine of the city and thought about the distance between loud victory and quiet repair. Quiet repair wins. It lasts. It does not demand a crowd, it simply refuses to fail, and then refuses again. By spring, I could tell time by the sound of bikes on the trail and the first call from the bakery at dawn. I had built a life that did not need to shout to be true, and it was mine to keep days stacked like clean plates, and the cupboard did not rattle. The phone stopped acting like a siren and returned to being a tool. I learned the names of neighbors I had only waved at, and the block felt smaller in the good way. On clear nights, I stood on the balcony and listened to the low engine of the city and thought about the distance between loud victory and quiet repair. Quiet repair wins. It lasts. It does not demand a crowd. It simply refuses to fail, and then refuses again. By spring, I could tell time by the sound of bikes on the trail and the first call from the bakery at dawn. I had built a life that did not need to shout to be true, and it was mine to keep days stacked like clean plates, and the cupboard did not rattle. The phone stopped acting like a siren and returned to being a tool. I learned the names of neighbors I'd only waved at, and the block felt smaller in the good way. On clear nights, I stood on the balcony and listened to the low engine of the city and thought about the distance between loud victory and quiet repair. Quiet repair wins. It lasts. It does not demand a crowd. It simply refuses to fail, and then refuses again. By spring, I could tell time by the sound of bikes on the trail and the first call from the bakery at dawn. I had built a life that did not need to shout to be true, and it was mine to keep.